Yeah, good evening to you all. So this is the third session in a retreat on this little mini retreat on the wisdom of emptiness for this module. So let's see. Last session we spent half the time on identifying the object of negation and half the time on establishing the selflessness of persons, right? And especially doing the 4-point analysis to establish that. So this session will spend the first half on establishing the selflessness of phenomena, right? So meditating on the dependent, the empty nature of things other than persons, which can include, of course, the constituents of the person, things in our continuum, our body and mind, um, those being empty of inherent existence, and then also things that are outside of a person's continuum, like tables and chairs and trees and other things. Um, yep. So we'll spend the first half on the selflessness of phenomena, and the second half on quantum mechanics and uh, dependent arising and emptiness. So that one I don't have much experience with, but anyway, the um, the um, the idea is just to think about some of the similarities and differences where we can. And we can, I mean, yeah, you can use the notes, the outlines I gave, or anything you've read, um, to that, or yeah, whatever you know about quantum mechanics. And you can expand also outside quantum mechanics, look at other fields of science also, um, to see how, yeah, what are similarities and differences in terms of phenomena being dependently arisen and thereby empty of existing from their own side. Anyway, we'll talk more about that when we come to it. So first, yeah, why don't we start with a little bit of meditation and generate a motivation and generate mind of refuge, if you like. So get comfortable in your meditation seat. Pick through the 8 points of the Vajrayana posture, and generally you see that you're relaxed and alert and comfortable. And then gradually try to focus your mind on an object of contemplation and do placement meditation for a couple minutes. And then generate a positive motivation session. So if you like, you can visualize yourself surrounded by all sentient beings, as we've done before. Yeah, or just generate positive motivation in any other way. So it's ideally generate a bodhicitta motivation, aspiration to achieve full enlightenment in order to be of the greatest benefit to other sentient beings. In a couple minutes, generating positive motivation in whatever way is most comfortable for you. And then generate a field of refuge. Yep, so if you'd like to generate of refuge, the Buddha Dharma Sangha, then visualize representations of the Buddha Dharma Sangha or the field of refuge in the space in front of you in whatever way you're most familiar. I can recite this refuge, the refuge in Bodhicitta Para 3 times. I take refuge until I'm enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my 2 collections of listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha, or meditating on the Dharma. May I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. I take refuge until I'm enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my 2 collections of meditating on the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. I take refuge until I'm enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my 2 collections of meditating on the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. Let's see, I'll share my PowerPoint slide. So, yep, so again, you can have open any notes or materials like to refer to. So the way to divide up the way to divide up, well, the way, the outlines the way Pabonka Rinpoche in Liberation of the Palm of Your Hand divides up meditation on the selflessness of phenomena. Is first you do, there's, when you divide up phenomena other than the person, there are phenomena that are conditioned things, so impermanent things, and then there are those that are permanent. So first divide up into two groups, those that are conditioned phenomena and those that are unconditioned phenomena, are permanent things. And then of the conditioned phenomena, it divides up into three: physical things and consciousness and non-associated compositional factors. And then just, yeah, so suggest that we spend time meditating on the selflessness of each of those, kind of examples of each of those one by one. Yeah, because they're a little different. So physical things, um, yeah, looking at how they're dependent primarily on parts, physical parts. Consciousness, how they're primarily dependent upon parts in time, and then imputed upon the collection of parts. And then non-associated compositional factors, they're, yeah, they have both physical parts and also, or instances, examples of them, and then parts in time as well. So yeah, so physical things uses, can use examples like a table, a letter, a house, so forth, as what we did before. To think about, so the basic idea here is to think about whatever examples looking at, to go through the 4-point analysis, recognize how they appear and grasp at them as existing from their own side, and then recognize if they actually exist in that way, then they should be findable as something inherently existent when we search for them. And then if findable, they must be either findable within the basis of imputation or separate from that. And then using different reasonings, establish that they're not findable within their basis of imputation, and they're also not findable separate from that. So we essentially do the 4-point analysis, the same that we did in the person, but with relation to a phenomena. So yeah, let's meditate first, then on, say, some physical objects. So find your own examples, then try to go through this 4-point analysis, analyze to see how does it appear to my mind ordinarily, the object, and then is it true there's only these two possibilities, that it exists either same as or different from its basis of imputation. So it's helpful to identify it first, once you identify how it appears to exist from its own side, then identify the object of imputation, how that object you're thinking about is imputed upon its basis of imputation. So it's important to be clear about that. And then the two possibilities, that either it exists as one with or different from its basis of imputation, and then why it's not inherently the same as or one with its basis of imputation. And then the fourth step, why it's not inherently different from that. And yeah, go through whatever examples kind of work best for you. We went through, like I was depicting earlier, a letter, table, car, I think we talked about quite a lot, a house, and then something like a president. And there's different examples you can use. Okay, so try that with regard to something, a physical object, for about a little less than 10 minutes, about 7 minutes first. And then you can also move on to things that are to consciousness, instance of consciousness, and non-associated compositional factors. We'll do those slowly. Okay. Let's meditate then on the 4-point analysis in relation to phenomena. So now I'd suggest you move on to consciousness. So look at it. So do the same analysis, 4-point analysis, but with regard to an instance of consciousness. So often when we do the meditate on the selfless phenomena, we're primarily meditating upon the aggregates of the person. Because once we meditate on the selflessness of persons and see that the person doesn't exist from their own side, then we tend to grasp at either the body or the mind, the aggregates of the person as existing from their own side. And especially of those two, are more likely to grasp at the consciousness or our own mind, or the continuum of consciousness as existing from its own side. So it's important to do an analysis of that to see how it does it. So to do the 4-point analysis. With the mind, especially. So we identify the object, how it appears, ordinarily appears to exist from its own side, then identify the two possibilities. It's either one with its parts or different from its parts. And then especially within the third step, identifying or establishing that it's not one with its parts, then there's these 3 faults that arise, that the past moments of consciousness would exist in the future as well, because if there would be exactly the same as the consciousness that they're parts of. So when consciousness exists, then the past moments also would exist, and they wouldn't be past. And then the past moments would not exist in the past because let's say the past moments would not exist in the past because past moments would not exist in the past because the future moments do not. Because the past moments and future moments, essentially, they'd be all mixed up. They would be the same because if they're inherently one thing, then they all have to exist inherently at the same time. Or the past and future moments are unrelated, and there are multiple separate consciousness through time. So just as if the consciousness itself were one with its parts, then it would be many instead of being one. And then the past and future moments would all exist at the same time. Or consciousness would not depend on its objects to exist. So if it exists separately from its parts, then it would be able to find consciousness separate from its basis of imitation, separate from its parts. You can't find it that way. And then consciousness would not depend upon the act of knowing and perceiving, because the acts of knowing and perceiving are aspects of or parts of consciousness. And for something to be conscious would not depend upon those parts. If it existed separately, inherently separate from its parts. So in short, spending about 10 minutes or so doing this 4-point analysis with regard to consciousness. So when we're doing the 4-point analysis, just again, the main strategy is just to see how the thing we're analyzing, it's a dependent arising, and because it's a dependent arising in different ways of independence upon parts, cause and conditions, and imputation, then that's totally contradictory to it being inherently existent. If it inherently exists, then it can't possibly be dependent arising in those different ways. Okay, so meditating on the selflessness of consciousness, or any example of a mind consciousness. So then in the last 10 minutes of the session, let's meditate on um, the selflessness of permanent phenomena. So the next, I mean, actually, in Palomar's outline is to look at non-associated compositional factors. We'll skip over that, but some examples of that are persons, then cause, impermanence, functioning state, and so forth. But they're not so important. So let's look at permanent phenomena, so or unconditioned phenomena. So although they don't depend on cause and conditions, but they do depend upon parts and mental imputation. So some examples are uncompounded space, and then depends upon direction, instances, uncompounded space in the east, west, north, south. And then, yeah, like a non-associated, what is it, non-affirming negation, like the lack of an elephant in the room, and emptiness itself. So let's primarily focus on emptiness itself. So because that's the one, we often grasp that emptiness as existing from its own side. So again, basically just go through the 4-point analysis, and the main thing being in relation to the third and fourth step, that how is emptiness itself a dependent arising? How does it depend upon being imputed by the mind upon um, its parts? So emptiness in general, right? Its parts are its instances, the emptiness of the table, emptiness of the person, selflessness of different persons, selflessness of different objects. So all instances of emptiness. Emptiness is something imputed upon those. And then if you look at a specific instance of emptiness, like if you do the 4-point analysis with regard to yourself, find that you, the person, are empty of inherently existing. But then how that emptiness is a characteristic of you, the person, right? Its existence depends upon the existence of the person. So any instance of emptiness, it has its basis being meaning that it's a characteristic of a particular phenomenon, particular object, and thereby it exists independence upon that object. And it depends upon a mind recognizing that it's a characteristic of that object. So in short, look at different instances of emptiness, and then see how they too do the 4-point analysis with regard to them, how they appear to exist from their own side. If they exist in that way, they must be either one with or different from their parts. Those are the only two possibilities. And while they're not one with the parts, and not observable separate from their parts. Or in place of those second and third steps, you can also just look at generally how any instance of emptiness is also a dependent arising, dependence upon parts and mental imputation. So try to meditate on emptiness of emptiness for about 10 minutes. So if you like, you can relax your attention there. Then we'll take a 10-minute break and then come back to meditate on quantum mechanics and then arises. Okay. So let's continue. So yeah, there's a few points to go through. I'll just kind of mention them gradually as we go. The first is that um, this general, well, as His Holiness observes here, this general observation that um, in both Buddhism and physics, then the kind of progression of understanding is one of seeing how things don't exist in the way they appear. Right. So that's one thing we can think about. And both science and Buddhism describe the divergence between things as they appear and things as they actually exist. And His Holiness says, I have the conviction that the great discoveries in physics give rise to the insight that reality is not as it appears. Right? So this is similar to when you study tenets, for example, or in any way, different aspects of Buddhism. You see that what you're discovering again and again is that things don't exist in the way they appear to us. So yeah, we can just meditate on that in different ways for I don't know 5 minutes or so, and yeah, compare the two, how in physics and Buddhism. And the more we understand, the more we learn, the more we see in a deeper and deeper way that the way things appear to us and the way they exist are different. So then the next thing to contemplate is how, this difference, the basic difference between um, Newtonian physics and quantum physics. So one of the ways to look at it is that, as His Holiness observes here, the principal motives underlying science and scientific and philosophical inquiry into the basic constituents of matter is to find matter's irreducible building blocks. So you see in Buddhism, also the lower tenet schools, the Abhashaka, especially, then they look for and they assert the existence of partless particles, fundamental building blocks of matter that are themselves indivisible. Right? And this was the same idea also in ancient Greece. And even up to very recently, the idea that if we keep looking for smaller and smaller particles, eventually we can find the smallest kind of fundamental particle that's a fundamental building block, while matter that itself is no further reducible, it's irreducible, regardless. So that's one aspect of Newtonian physics. And then another we can contemplate is just this general idea. So this is a diagram by Vic and Slit, that just the idea that discrete independent reality of objects is primary. So that's why the cylinders are dark. And then the relationships between them is secondary. Whereas in quantum mechanics, it's the opposite. The relationships between things are primary, and the things themselves are secondary, because the things themselves are fundamentally dependent upon relationships. And then, I will leave those quotes up. Yeah, and then another aspect of Newtonian. So another way to compare Newtonian kind of physics and Newtonian worldview versus that of contemporary physics is, I mean, we should relate to quantum mechanics first. In Newtonian worldview, then every physical object has a objectively existent location in space, and and you could say and velocity, with movement, and direction of movement, and speed of its movement, and its location in space both exist independent of an observer, and they're easily definable. As in quantum mechanics, then there's an aspect of non-locality. We'll look at more later, but things don't have, minute particles, quantum particles. They don't have a definable location or velocity or momentum, I could say, momentum, independent of observation, right? Without reference to a measurement, active measurement or observation. And then also, just, elaborate a bit more. If you look at general relativity, which we didn't, but in Newtonian physics, then time is considered to flow in a uniform way in all places. Then the movement of time is considered to be the same, whereas in general relativity, it's different. Time moves at different speeds in different places. And then also the force of gravity is considered to be the same in all places and all times. Actually, that one I'm not sure about. So anyway, those look at some different aspects to whatever your ability or understanding between, but especially this one, between objects being fundamentally existing as objects, kind of independent of other objects versus fundamentally being things that are related to other objects. So think about, reflect on those things for 5 minutes or so. Newtonian physics worldview versus the worldview of quantum mechanics. So then let's look more deeply at quantum mechanics itself. So I'm going to look at the double slit experiment, reflect on that. But the idea here is that, well, so when we look for, so we can relate this back to ourself as a person. When we look for, what we are as a person, one of our main constituents is our body. And it looks like, a body ordinarily appears to be a quite concrete, real. It's kind of a solid thing. But then when we, analyze more deeply, we can see it's made up of atoms. And the atoms are made up of primarily mostly space, and then even the um, particles of the atoms, electrons, protons, especially the neutrons, then they're made up of um, smaller particles. And then even those quantum particles, then they're not um, fundamentally particles or waves, right? They exist in both kind of a wave, at times a wave, at times a particle state, depending upon kind of how they're measured, right? So this is where quantum mechanics becomes really weird. And it just shows that at a very deep fundamental level, even things that, we're going to grasp at anything as being, real, solid, it's physical things. But even physical things are, at their kind of most subtle level of their constituent parts, finite, or the smallest level of their constituent parts, they're very indeterminate as being existing as either particle or wave. So in Newtonian physics, if something is a particle, it's not a wave. If something is a wave, it's not a particle. Really different, and they exist apart, independent of observation. Quantum mechanics, with something exists as a particle or wave, it also seems to exist to be dependent upon whether it's being observed or not. And so then the whole role of how is consciousness a fundamental factor in determining how something exists comes into play. So yeah, how to do this? I mean, it's best. Yeah, it'll take up a lot of time if I go through and explain the whole um, double slit experiment again. So hopefully you can remember um, somewhat. But basically, you can just look at these diagrams. Basically, if you shoot photons through one slit, they just act like particles. If you shoot through two slits, then they generate this interference pattern on the screen, which means as they go through the two slits, I mean, you shoot one photon at a time, so ostensibly it should just go through one slit or the other and act like a particle, but it doesn't. It seems like when the photon passes through the slits, it passes through both, kind of, and acts like a wave, and thereby creates this wave interference pattern on the measuring screen back. So it seems like between when it leaves the photon gun, where it's a particle, and when it's measured on the screen, it's a particle. Between these, it's acting like a wave. But then if you put a detector, so you detect which slit it goes through, then that collapses the wave function, and it actually acts like a particle and doesn't create an interference pattern because it's all of a sudden, because it's being detected as it goes through one slit or the other, it's acting like a particle. But then if you leave the detector there and just turn it off, then again, it acts like a wave when it goes through the double slits. So there's, yeah, basically that shows how the act of measurement collapses the wave function. But when the quantum particle is not being measured, it's expanding in, its location is indeterminate. So this is an example of quantum non-locality. Its location, and it's totally indeterminate. Its location only becomes definite when it's observed, in dependence upon the act of observation. So yeah, maybe I'll leave this description up. So let's just try to contemplate that related things, how at a fundamental level physical things are yeah, made up of quantum particles, and the quantum particles are indeterminate as waves or particles. Um, they don't have a definable location independent of the act of observation. And how that's similar to, um, in yeah, quite deep way, similar to the Buddhist idea that things are primarily dependently arising. And one of the most fundamental types of dependent arising is dependence upon mental imputation. Things only exist in relation to an observer. And finally, for 5 minutes or so, let's look at quantum entanglement. So here's a description on the screen. But yeah, basically it's when two particles are separated at a great distance, and then a measurement is made on one of the particles, then the other particle is found to instantly correlate, um, such that it seems to indicate that there's a kind of underlying um, type of relationship between particles that are can be even very, very distant from each other, in a way that is kind of not well understood and not um, definitely doesn't fit into the Newtonian physical worldview. Um, but it seems to indicate that there's, yeah, this kind of intimate, powerful sort of relationship between physical phenomena in a way that, yeah, it's not seen in any other aspect of physics. So again, it just is more evidence for the interconnectedness of things and the fundamental importance of um, interdependent arising being a fundamental property and characteristic of things. And then also, so we can in the last part here, you can also bring in, yeah, other instances of dependent arising, other evidence for things being fundamentally dependently arisen, as found in other fields of science in general. So let's just reflect on that for, yeah, a little over 5 minutes, about 5 minutes or so. Okay, so we can stop there. So let's dedicate then whatever merit we've created by meditating on selflessness of phenomena and similarities, differences between physics and Buddhism. Then by that merit, then we can rejoice, and then by that, may all sentient beings be free from every form of suffering and the cause of suffering, especially afflictive emotions and the fundamental cause, the ignorance, grasping at self and phenomena existing from their own side, and all of the forms of ignorance that lead to suffering. And may all such beings have every cause for well-being and happiness up to full enlightenment, especially wisdom, realizing interdependence and emptiness. And then may spiritual teachings which benefit sentient beings flourish, continue to exist for a long time, and may all of our teachers' lives be long and stable, and all beings abide in harmony with one another. Then if there are any other prayers or aspirations you'd like to add, bring them to mind. So may all your prayers also be accomplished in accordance with your virtuous wishes. Okay, so we conclude that for today. Then there's just one more session on Tuesday at a regular timing. Generally, I think dependent arising and emptiness, and then in daily life, looking at how to apply, how to use meditation on emptiness in relation to daily life kind of situations. Yep. Okay. Thank you. And see you next time.
Thank you, Venerable Alexa.
Thank you,
Thank you, Venerable Lexa, Mary Ellen, and Urs.